All right. So in this class, we've been talking about how we function as Christians in an ever-changing world. I think it's not any surprise to us as we kind of look out and look at the culture and how fast it's changing, technology, how fast that's changing. I forget what the dollar amount is, but the platform Zoom, it grew by, billions and billions and billions of dollars in the last several months because, they were an online platform and everybody shifted online. Schools, churches, businesses, the majority of people in this country had to shift overnight to online, and that is going to forever change the landscape of how we do meetings and how we, even how we worship, small group Bible studies. That landscape is forever changed because of COVID. This is not a temporary thing. It's not like the online portion is just going to go away and it's going to fizzle out. It's here to stay. It's a permanent change, and that happened literally overnight. So, those are not necessarily bad things, but in the midst of that, certainly there are some bizarre things. We look at our culture and just look at some of the things that we tolerate and embrace and celebrate, and it's really disheartening, I think, for a lot of people. The question is, what do we do about it? And, that was kind of a question Charles had raised. And he said, I really want a class on kind of what do we do about all this stuff that's falling apart around us? Because here we are. Our culture it is what it is. I don't think that we should be under any illusion that we're going to go out and change the culture. The Christians certainly didn't go out in the first century. If we read our Bibles, they didn't go to change the culture. They went out to be countercultural and to live within that culture. And I think Paul said it best when he said, I'm not asking you to leave the world. That would be impossible to do. Just don't be of the world. Don't join in. But certainly go into the world. Have friends who are not Christians. Expect them to look differently than you. Paul said he became all things to all people so that he might win some for Christ. Paul wasn't out to win everybody. He knew, again, he was under no illusion that he was going to win mass amounts of people. In fact, it was kind of the opposite for Paul. Paul was mostly hated by people. Him and the other disciples who went out, it's not like they were out to pad their spiritual bank and, get their cup filled up. I think we've talked about that a lot, like this notion of just getting your cup filled up and kind of leeching off of the back of the church to feel better about yourself. That's just not, it's not a healthy way to live out your Christianity. And that's an unhealthy expectation that's placed on the shoulders of the church. So a healthier model is to be part of the body of Christ, which is kind of what our theme is this year for the sermons. Our theme this year is equipping the saints for works of ministry. So in the first century, hopefully the class on archaeology gave you a good idea of what the culture was like outside of the Judeo-Christian world. It was rough. Christians, they were in a rough culture. There was a tremendous religious syncretism, the synchronizing of different religions and kind of blending those together. Every single city that was built or rebuilt throughout the Roman Empire had temples to the Roman gods and goddesses. And it was basically accepted or expected that if you lived in the Roman Empire, you worshiped those gods. Now, it wasn't strictly enforced at first, so there was some tolerance for other religions, including Judaism. The Roman Empire was pretty tolerant towards other religions, but it still was kind of expected. It was like this unwritten rule that you still should, not disrespect the Roman gods and goddesses. And at the same time, you should uphold Pax Romana, Roman peace. That was the one thing that you did not ever mess up. You never disturbed Roman peace, or you were shut down quick and hard. So Jesus was brought up in this wild culture. Nudity was everywhere. Romans and Greeks especially loved nudity. So they would have permanent portraits of mostly, I shouldn't say mostly women, because it was a combination of both, men and women, but full-on nudity everywhere. I mean, think about raising your little kids, right? We kind of freak out about what's on television, and television basically is softcore pornography. It's gotten pretty raunchy in the last 20 years. The things that are acceptable, it's bizarre, it's gross. But it's no different than what people saw in the first century. It was everywhere. If you traveled, if you left the four walls of your house, you were going to see nudity. It just was, it was out there and it was celebrated. So, what did Jesus do, and who did Jesus call us to be in that culture? And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about in this class. With the culture that's changing around us really quickly, I think the church is really struggling to find its place in this world, because the church traditionally, especially conservative churches, we don't do change well. And it's not a bad thing. That's not a criticism. We don't like flip-flopping and changing all the time. Like it seems like it seems almost schizophrenic to us. If we see things rapidly changing, constantly changing, and we're going to change this and we're going to change that, and you're always changing things, it kind of makes us hyperventilate a little bit. And I'm saying that as somebody who likes change. And it's still, it's like, what's another way to describe it? Natalie makes fun of me because when we walk into Walmart, I'm a visual person, so I get visual overload. There is stuff everywhere. I get instant anxiety when I walk into Walmart. There's just so much stuff that it's overwhelming. And that sensation, that feeling, I think is what a lot of Christians are feeling when we see the culture changing constantly. It's like this revolving door that is just spinning faster and faster and faster, where eventually you just step back because you think, if I walk in that door, I'm going to get ground up into a, and there are going to be bits and pieces of me everywhere. So, I think the church is really struggling to find its place in the midst of this culture. And I think, this is my feeling, I think one of the things that the church is probably going to tend to do is to become even more isolated from the world, which is not what Christ calls us to be. And so, how do we find this balance, and how do we find our place in the midst of this culture? So we're going to focus on this story today because I think it's just magnificent, and it really shows the heart of what Jesus was doing in this culture, where the religious leaders were hunkering down, and they were laying their stakes down, and they were saying, we are sick of the world changing around us. We are Jews, and we believe in God, and this is what we believe, and if it doesn't fit in this box, it can go. And we're going to show how Jesus responded to that. Okay, so John chapter 5, I have this on the slides here. The healing at the pool on the Sabbath. This is John chapter 5, beginning in verse 1. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. By the way, there were 3 feasts that required all Jewish people to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year. No matter where you lived, you had to come into Jerusalem. So Jerusalem was packed at this point, absolutely packed. Verse 2, now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. Now, I underlined a multitude. The Greek word is pletho, which is where we get our word for plethora from. Pletho, there laid a pletho, a plethora, a multitude of invalids. What does this tell you? Or what comes to mind when you see this? What image comes to your mind for those of you who are visual learners? What do you see when you hear that? Lots of invalids, lots of chronically ill people. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, in my mind, I picture just this from wall to wall, these 5 massive colonnades, this big roofed-in area, and as far as the eye can see, just jam-packed with invalids, chronically ill people. What else comes to mind? Keep in mind what's going on. It's one of the 3 feasts in Jerusalem. We don't know which one because John doesn't tell us. But there are millions of Jewish people visiting Jerusalem. It is packed. This is at the temple, which is the center of religious activity. So who else is there besides the invalids? Everyone. Tens of thousands of people would have been walking past all these invalids. And I emphasis on walking past. Yeah. Yeah, John certainly doesn't paint a picture that this is like a ministry epicenter where people are here and they're doing ministry and they're feeding, and these people are obviously hungry, they're sick, they're chronically ill. John paints no picture whatsoever that anybody here is doing ministry except Jesus. Verse 5, one man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. 38 years. Now, in my mind, I imagine this guy was an invalid since birth. Maybe that's not the case. Maybe he was older. Maybe this was an elderly man who had an accident or a sickness or whatever and was an invalid for 38 years. We don't know whether he was 38 years old and was born an invalid or whether he's an elderly man who had been an invalid for 38 years. Either way, 38 years is almost my entire life. Just to put that in perspective, I'm 41. 38 years, this guy was an invalid. By the way, I don't know if, let me read the next verse and then we'll back up. Verse 6, when Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" What do you find interesting about that question? Of course he wants to be healed. Right. I mean, that is a rhetorical question of all rhetorical questions. Do you want to be healed? And how would you expect, without reading ahead, how would you expect, if this were you, how would you respond? Yeah. Yes, I want to be healed. But listen to the guy's response. The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I am going, another steps down before me." Huh? That's an interesting response to, do you want to be healed? Isn't it? Well, you'll find something missing in the text. If you go back up and you look, there's a verse 3, and then there's a verse 5. There's no verse 4. The ESV, unfortunately, doesn't put a footnote or anything to explain it. They just kind of secretly take that verse out and kind of, if you weren't really paying attention, you'd never notice that there was a verse missing in the first place. Other versions here, this puts a little footnote in. There's a little C there, and it has this. Some manuscripts insert wholly or in part. I have nobody, he's waiting for the moving of the water. This is verse 4. For an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred the water. Whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was healed of whatever disease he had. Okay, so John did not write this. This is not part of the original manuscript. Somebody later on went in and they edited the text, the handwritten text, as they were copying manuscripts. They edited and added this verse to that. Likely, it was somebody who knew this myth among Jewish people. And he was afraid that people were not going to have context and they wouldn't know why this guy responded in such a weird way. So he added this verse. And I'm thankful that this editor added this verse because I would have had no clue why the guy responded in such a weird way. So we go back and look at his response. Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I'm going, another steps down before me. So in other words, every time ripples go across the water, and in his mind, the angel of the Lord is stirring the water, and the first person into the water is going to be healed. Every time I try to go in, somebody goes before me. The guy's defeated. This is a desperate response to Jesus, saying, instead of saying, well, yeah, of course I want to be healed. What the guy's saying is, Lord, I've done everything my whole life that I know how to do to be healed. And I'm exhausted. I mean, if we were to fill in the blanks, in between the lines, that's what the guy's saying. Sir, I am exhausted. I've done everything I know how to do to be healed. Verse 8, Jesus said to him, get up, take your bed, and walk. And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed, and he walked. Let's pause there a second. What does this tell you about this guy? What do you know about the healings that Jesus does of people? What does he usually respond to people? If he asks them a question, or if he heals them, or if they don't say anything, or if they cry out, Lord, have mercy on us, and he heals them, what does he usually say? What does he bring that back to? Your blank has made you well. Yeah, your faith has made you well. What does that say about this guy, given what we typically know about Jesus? The guy had faith to be healed. Obviously, the guy had faith to be healed, or he wouldn't be at the pool in the first place. He's not some guy who just believes in Santa Claus and, wants a guy in a red suit to come and, the guy really believes. He's desperate, and he believes that he'll do anything to be healed, even if it's embarrassing, even if people mock him when they go by. And keep in mind, how many people are here? It's packed. Yeah, there are multitudes of people. Can you imagine this guy shoveling himself into the pool, and the embarrassment of what that would look like for this guy trying to get himself out of the water? It's not like he's athletic and he just jumps in and, plops in and plops back out and, before anybody notices. There's flailing and there's, probably gasping and taking in water and coughing. And this is a wretched, pitiful sight. And Jesus questioned, do you want to be made well? Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. Which tells you what? Again, I'm going to keep going back to this. Who's there to help? Among all this sea of people, who's there to help? Nobody. Yeah. And you can't blame them either. Yeah, you can't blame the people for the chaos. They all want the same thing. They want someone to help them into the water so they can be made well. They just want to get better. They want their life back. And all these religious people are walking by, walking right past them. And I think it's interesting, this is the one place where Jesus settles in on. So, before I go on and read the rest of the story, I pause here for a moment. I think about where we are as a church in 2021. And I think about, I talk about inventory a lot. If we take inventory with how we spend our time, not just as a group of Christians gathered together, but just individually, if we take an inventory of our mind and say, where do I spend the majority of my time as a Christian? Where do I spend the majority of my time exercising brain power, thinking about things? Where do I expend that energy? Are we the person who Jesus described, who's sitting in the temple, who's looking at the person in the corner saying, thank you, God, for not making me like them? Or are we the person beating our breast, saying, God, help me, a sinner. Help me to be humble. Help me to see people like this. Help me to have the eyes to see the bleeding people right in front of me, the people who are struggling, the people who are suffering. Keep me humble and always direct me towards people who need me. Right? And if I take inventory myself, it's pretty embarrassing where I spend a lot of my energy and time, where my mind, what I think about. Whether it's just, enjoyment, entertainment, vegging out in front of the TV, watching show after show, or movies, or just kind of browsing social media because you're bored and you have nothing better to do, or whatever it is, right? Do we do those things? Or are we judging the world saying, thank God I'm not like them? Right? Because Jesus condemns that behavior too. Or are we going into the trenches where people are really suffering? And are we doing what Jesus did? Because he just steps right in. He just does it. Doesn't even hesitate. Thousands of people around. And Jesus wades right into the middle of them and just starts healing. I think that's incredible. Now we're going to read the rest of this. Now that day was the Sabbath. If you know anything about the religious people, this really is getting under their skin. Because now, not only is Jesus spending time with those losers on the mats, right? Who are taking up space at the temple. And I imagine this chaos, Roxanne, is probably the right terminology. Not just for jumping in the water, but the crying out. I mean, as all these people are walking by, this is a very busy part of the temple. As people are walking by, these invalids, this sea of invalids aren't sitting here with their arms crossed, twiddling their thumbs, saying, well, we better be polite and just hope somebody gives us food for the day. Right? They're doing what? Verbal. What do you hear? I asked what you see. Now what do you hear with this scene? Yeah, lots of begging. Begging, crying out, screaming, pleading, wailing, desperation. And imagine a multitude of people who are in the same boat. And I imagine there's a little bit of a competition going on because this guy wants to be the first one in the water, along with everybody else, to be healed. But what about food? That's the healing part. What about the daily bread part? You want to be the loudest beggar because you want your food for the day. And it's this competition. I hear just pure loudness and chaos, and I mean ear-shattering. That Natalie and I were talking about our kids over Christmas break, because those kids' voices have a certain frequency that penetrates the eardrum in a way that no other voice can. And it's that bone-chilling, like it vibrates your skull. It's that frequency. And there's something about kids' voices that just, yeah, like chalkboard nails. It's a little satanic in some regards. But, you know, we joke about that. But can you imagine this sound? Can you imagine how loud and shrilling and ear-piercing this sound of desperation was? And I think the religious people did everything in their power to get away from that, to avoid this area, because it's chaos. Now it's on the Sabbath. Jesus walks right into the crowd, wades right in. Puts the waders on, knee high, goes right in. Do you want to be healed? It's the first words that John records, first words out of his mouth. Do you want to be healed? Now that day was the Sabbath, so the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It's the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed." That's the response to the man who's been an invalid for 38 years. 38 years this man suffered. 38 years this man was begging for food. 38 years this man was embarrassing himself, throwing himself, flopping into the water and flailing around trying to get healed. 38 years this guy suffered, and their response to them is, "It's the Sabbath, and it's not lawful for you to take up your bed." Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah, absolutely. Great point. Yeah, he didn't leave his bed behind because that's probably the only thing he owns. He still has to sleep. He's still poor. He's still desperate, even though he's healed. That desperation doesn't just vanish. And that's their response. It's a Sabbath. It's not, you know, they're legalistic to the core. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, good point. Yeah. Yeah, they were taking the law of Moses and putting it on steroids, and that was one of Jesus' problems with the religious leaders, is you forsake the commandments of God for your own traditions. Why don't your disciples wash their hands? Okay, show me where that law is. Yeah.
The man said to me, "Take up your bed and walk." Mm-hmm. That verse, I see more of God's command. We listen to the voice of men who put these heavy burdens on us.
Yeah.
We listen to the voice of God, who knows what we should be doing, and not worry about what man says.
Yeah.
You care less what they thought. Man told man to heal, told him to get up and walk, and he did it.
That's it. You know, and I think a big thrust of this class is going to be talking about that. And that was one of the things that Charles had asked is, he's like, I know what God says. I know what man says. I know some of the laws that are being passed right now that are they're just asinine. And so his question, and it's the right question, is how do we fit into that? Because eventually we're going to have these laws that are just so messed up. I mean, we're getting to that point. It's going to happen. I think we're delusional if we think it's not eventually going to happen. And so the question is, as Christians, how do we respond? You know, and I think, you know, you bring up a good point, Bob, because I didn't see Jesus calling for revolutions. I didn't see him calling people to take up arms and make posters and protest the streets and put barricades and set things on fire in the middle of the streets and, exercise, whatever amendment rights you want to point to. What I saw Jesus do is this. He didn't, it's not like he advertised this and was like, all right, let me get the camera out. Social experiment, right? Like, he wasn't interested in any kind of attention. He was just interested in doing what was right, even knowing that he knew that this thing was going to take them to a level 40 out of 10 on the anger scale. Jesus knew that. It's not like he did this and was like, well, what? Right? He knew this was going to peeve people off, and he didn't care. And I think that's part of why he did it so boldly and so quickly and so matter-of-factly. I think of, the scriptures, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Jesus didn't make excuses for doing this. He didn't apologize. He didn't say, well, how can I do this in a cordial manner that won't upset the majority of people? He wasn't interested in that.
Another way of looking at that or saying something on that, Jesus certainly wasn't a military leader, and he never encouraged anybody to riot in the streets or anything like that.
Sure.
At the same time, you could take another take on that and say what you were just saying. He knew that what he was going to do was going to stir up a hornet's nest, and he knew that he was going against their rules and their laws, but he knew what God's law was.
Yeah.
He was, in a way, you can say he was protesting.
Yeah.
Or
peaceful protest.
Peaceful protest.
I mean, good point.
Yeah, so it depends on the way you look at that. But
yeah.
Certainly he's not saying, rise up with your arms and go take, in fact, he says that to his
yeah.
apostles. If I wanted to, I could have my father send 12 legions, or, I don't know if it's 12 legions, something like that.
Yeah.
Angels, and so I'm not here to fight.
Yeah.
I'm here to do what I'm supposed to do.
To do what's right, yeah. Luke chapter 4, when he reads from the scroll of Isaiah, he lays out what his mission is. I'm here to free the oppressed, to take care of the poor, to feed them. That's why he was here, and he did it. And I think that's a great point. We're all about being seen and being heard. When things at least feel oppressive from the state, and this year has been, I think, a great example of overreach. To put it nicely. But I think the way a lot of people want to respond is by shouting and yelling and setting things on fire. And Jesus, if you want to look at it that way, and I think that's perfectly fine to say, he was peacefully protesting this kind of garbage, this kind of mindset. But he did it by taking action. He didn't hold up signs. Because that you might change a couple people's minds by doing that, by being coercive and being loud and shutting streets down and, being a nuisance in your community. You might change a couple minds, maybe. But Jesus wasn't interested in changing minds. He was interested in changing people.
I think it comes down to just doing the right thing. Whatever happens.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Make headlines.
Yeah.
Or not.
Sure.
Do the right thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's really where Jesus put his focus on, and he called Christians to do likewise. And I think it's such an important lesson because right now, I think if we look at our skin, there's stuff bubbling under it all the time. Like there's just stuff that it is agitating us to our core. We all feel it. We all feel the anxiety, the frustration, the anger, the disappointment. We feel all those things. And I think a lot of people they don't know what to do with that. And Jesus just goes right back. And every single time he goes right back to exactly what you said. He just did what was right. And called other people to do likewise. You were going to say something, Roxanne?
I don't see that he said to the 10 people around him, now come on, watch what I do here.
That's right. Yeah, there's no indication of that.
Right. So to me that says I shouldn't be going and saying to five of my friends, come on with me while we do this.
Yeah.
I should just go and do what God wants me to do and not worry about the people around me.
Not that that's wrong. There were times where he did that, where he grabbed his disciples and he would grab them, and that's part of discipleship, showing them to do. Certainly, like our kids, we love grabbing our kids when we go serve, and we don't draw attention to it. We're not like, all right, kids, watch how it's done, you know? Like, he didn't do that. He just went and he did it. And then he turned to his disciples, and he would turn that into a lesson. And oftentimes, this is kind of interesting, and Matthew does this a lot, where there's this big crowd. And then Matthew will say something like, and then he turned and said to his disciples, ... And so it's almost like this picture of Jesus turning his back to the crowd with them as the backdrop. So his disciples he's intentionally getting his disciples to look beyond him at the people, at the multitude of people in desperation. And then he has this private, abject lesson that's specifically for his disciples about reaching them, about reaching the crowds. And I think that's how Jesus taught. He wasn't like, okay, watch how it's done. Let me get my camera out and we'll put this on social media and see how many likes it gets. You know, like he wasn't interested in that. Yes?
You had mentioned this a little bit ago about going out in the street, riding, and setting things on fire, and that nature, where we might change some minds. I think not only really change minds, I think you put fear into people. So I think maybe they just bow down under that pressure.
Yeah.
Just being fearful. And I think when we look at what Christ did, he didn't change minds, he changed the hearts.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
And I think if we do what he did, if I'm out there doing things, and he tells us, right? If I'm out there doing things as, hey, look at me, I get my reward here on earth. That's not what God expects.
That's right.
But if I'm out there doing just what Jesus did, now he knew he would maybe get a beat.
I think that was clear.
He worked well like that.
Yeah.
I think I'm maybe the same thing, but I think it's
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm not worried about what they think about me out there. I'm not worried about what I look like. I'm not worried about what someone can do to this body. I'm worried about my eyes on Christ.
Yeah.
So that we cross that finish.
Yeah. And to me that's exciting because it's you see the result of this. You know, the religious leaders are the ones that end up looking like idiots because they're now trying to kill him because he healed somebody. He fixed somebody. Yeah, that's right. You were going to say something, Brent.
I don't think that we should do something just to get noticed.
Yeah.
At the same time, I don't think we should shy away from doing something just because we think it will get noticed.
No, that's right. Nope. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you don't do everything so secretively that nobody will ever find out. And if they do, then, you know, like, it's fine. Obviously, people found out. We're talking about it 2,000 years later. You know? I'm going to finish this, and then we're way out of time. Verse 13. Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn. As there was a crowd in the place. I underline that again just to reemphasize. There's this big crowd of people. There are tons of people. And nobody's doing anything to help the sick except Jesus. Afterward, Jesus found himself in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." Back to Bob's point. You know, he was here to work, and specifically to do his Father's work. He had no interest. I say this a lot. Jesus had very little interest in making friends. He was not out there to start campfires and get big groups of people to have devotionals under campfires. He was there. He was there to work, and he was there to do his Father's work, and that was it. To do what was right. All right, we're out of time. We're going to stop there, and we'll pick up in a little bit. Thanks, guys.